Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. 5 days ago, the U.S. Senate passed one of the toughest Russia sanctions bills Washington has seen in years. The vote was 86-11. But there was something unusual about the man whose name was attached to the bill. Lindsey Graham wasn't there to see it pass. He had died before the Senate finally voted on legislation he had spent years pushing. And now, what may become one of Graham's final legislative legacies could give President Trump a powerful new weapon not only against Russia, but potentially against China. Because buried inside this Russia sanctions bill is a provision that could have enormous consequences for one of Russia's most important customers, China. So the obvious question is Washington preparing to hit China with a 100% tariff? I don't think that's actually the most important question. The better question is, why does Washington want the legal power to do it in the first place? Because sometimes, in international politics, the weapon you don't use can be just as important as the weapon you do. Let's start with the bill itself. The legislation, which Lindsey Graham had spent years pushing, would dramatically increase pressure on Russia. It targets Russia's energy sector, its financial system, senior officials, and the so-called shadow fleet used to move Russian oil around international sanctions. The Senate passed it by an overwhelming 8-6-11 vote. That number matters, because despite all the political divisions in Washington, there is still significant bipartisan support in Congress for maintaining pressure on Vladimir Putin and raising the cost of Russia's war effort. But there's another part of the legislation that matters even more for this story. It doesn't only target Russia. It gives the president the authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on countries that continue to be major purchasers of Russian energy. And that is where this story suddenly becomes much bigger. Because China is one of Russia's biggest energy customers. India is another major buyer. Other countries, including Hungary, Slovakia, and Azerbaijan, also appear in the framework of countries potentially exposed to the legislation. So this isn't simply a bill saying, Russia, we're going to punish you. It creates a much broader mechanism. If you continue helping Russia generate energy revenue, Washington may be able to punish you too. And that changes the strategic calculation. But we need to be very careful about what the bill actually says. There is a huge difference between the president can impose a tariff of up to 100% and the president must impose a 100% tariff. Those are not the same thing. The legislation gives Trump a weapon. It does not necessarily require him to fire it immediately. And that distinction is the key to understanding what happens next. Imagine Trump sitting across the negotiating table from Beijing. The conversation isn't necessarily just about Russia. It could be about tariffs. It could be about Chinese exports. It could be about rare earths. It could be about technology restrictions. It could be about supply chains. It could be about the future of trade between the two countries. And now, Trump has another card. He can say, you don't have to stop buying Russian oil tomorrow, but if you remain one of Russia's biggest energy customers, I now have the authority to impose tariffs as high as 100%. Trump may never actually use the full 100%. But Beijing has to consider the possibility. And once Beijing has to consider that possibility, the negotiating environment has changed. That is the real value of this legislation. Not necessarily the tariff itself. The leverage created by the possibility of the tariff. And this brings us to the larger U.S. China competition. If we look at the total number and variety of strategic tools available to each side, I think there is an uncomfortable reality for Beijing. America has more cards. The United States has the dollar. It has enormous influence over global finance. It has some of the world's deepest capital markets. It has leading positions in advanced technologies. It has major semiconductor companies and technology platforms. It has the world's most powerful military. And perhaps most importantly, it has a network of allies and strategic partners stretching across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Japan, South Korea, Australia, NATO, and many other economic and security partners. China has nothing comparable in terms of the breadth of that network. But that doesn't mean China is defenseless. In fact, China has several cards that Washington cannot easily play around. The biggest may be manufacturing. China has built one of the world's most complete industrial systems. It sits at the center of enormous global supply chains. It has massive production capacity, and it plays a major role in the processing of rare earths and other critical materials. Those aren't theoretical advantages. American companies actually depend on many of them. So, if Washington suddenly imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese goods across the board, Beijing would not simply surrender. China could retaliate. It could impose tariffs of its own. It could restrict exports of strategically important materials. It could target American companies operating in China. And it could use its position in global supply chains to raise the cost of Washington's policy. American businesses and consumers would feel some of that pain as well. So here's the key distinction. America has the broader hand. China has several cards that can make America's cards expensive to play. And that is why I don't expect Trump to immediately use the full 100% tariff authority against China. Having a weapon and having a reason to fire it are two different things. And China isn't the only constraint Trump has to worry about. There is also the American consumer. A 100% tariff would not simply punish Beijing. It could raise costs for U.S. importers, manufacturers, retailers, and households. If those costs move through the supply chain, they can add pressure to prices and inflation. And that creates a domestic political problem for any president. Trump could have the legal authority to impose the tariff and still decide that the economic and political costs aren't worth it. That's an important part of the calculation, because the question isn't simply, can Trump do it? The question is, what happens to the American economy if he does? That is why the smartest use of this authority may be to keep it available rather than immediately deploy it. Trump doesn't need to use the strongest possible tariff if the threat itself is producing results. Suppose Beijing continues buying large amounts of Russian oil. Trump doesn't necessarily need to announce a 100% tariff tomorrow. He can leave the threat on the table. Then another issue comes up 6 months later. Maybe trade negotiations stall. Maybe the two countries clash over technology. Maybe they disagree over critical minerals. Maybe Washington wants Beijing to change its behavior on Russia. Suddenly, that Russian energy issue becomes another pressure point. Trump can simply say, "We already have the authority." That is a very different negotiating position from starting from zero. And this is where I think the Lindsey Graham bill could matter far beyond Russia. It potentially connects two strategic problems that Washington has often treated separately. Russia needs energy revenue. China buys Russian energy. Therefore, Washington can try to turn China's economic relationship with Russia into another source of leverage. That doesn't mean the United States can force China to abandon Moscow. It can't. China is not going to simply follow Washington's instructions. And Beijing has its own reasons for maintaining its relationship with Russia. But Washington has created another variable that Chinese policymakers now have to include in their calculations. And that matters. Because in a long strategic competition, you don't necessarily win by using every weapon you have. You win by making the other side account for the weapons you could use. But there is a limit to that strategy. America's leverage is real, but it isn't free. Take technology. Washington can restrict China's access to advanced chips and semiconductor technology. That can impose real costs on China. But American companies can also lose access to Chinese customers. Take tariffs. Washington can raise the price of Chinese goods. But American consumers and businesses can face higher costs. Take supply chains. Washington can encourage companies to move manufacturing out of China. But rebuilding those supply chains takes years and costs enormous amounts of money. And take alliances. The United States can pressure its allies to take a tougher position toward Beijing. But those allies have their own economic interests. They may cooperate with Washington on security while resisting an economic confrontation that goes too far. So America's advantage isn't that it can simply dictate the outcome. America's advantage is that it has more options. China's advantage is that some of its strongest forms of leverage are deeply embedded in the global economy. That's why this competition is going to be so difficult. Neither side can easily knock the other out. And neither side can completely ignore the other. This also explains why I would be skeptical of headlines claiming Trump is about to impose a 100% tariff on China. Maybe he will someday. But that isn't the most useful way to understand the situation right now. What we know is that Washington is seeking the authority to make such a move possible. And that distinction is extremely important. The immediate effect may not be a tariff. It may be a negotiation. It may be a warning. It may be an incentive for China to reduce some of its purchases of Russian energy. The legislation also creates potential ways for countries to avoid the harshest consequences if they substantially reduce their purchases of Russian energy or no longer remain among the largest buyers. For smaller countries, that could create a meaningful incentive to change their behavior. For China, however, the calculation is much harder. China's energy demand is enormous. Russia is geographically close. Russian oil can be economically attractive, and Beijing has strategic reasons for maintaining a relationship with Moscow. So Washington is not presenting China with a simple choice. It is presenting China with a cost-benefit calculation. And that's really what economic statecraft is about. You don't always force the other side to surrender. Sometimes you simply make one option more expensive than another. That is exactly why this story is bigger than Russia. The United States is not necessarily preparing to launch a 100% tariff war against China. It is expanding the number of tools available if the relationship deteriorates. And that is something Beijing has to take seriously. But Washington should take something seriously too. If the United States keeps escalating economic pressure without considering the costs, it could eventually push China towards stronger retaliation and encourage other countries to build alternatives to American-controlled systems. The dollar is powerful. American technology is powerful. The American market is enormous. And America's alliances are powerful. But none of those advantages are unlimited. Every card has a price when you play it. And that is why I think the most important question isn't whether the United States has more leverage. It does. The more important question is whether Washington can use that leverage more effectively than Beijing can absorb it. That is the real competition. And it brings us back to Lindsey Graham. His bill began as an effort to increase pressure on Russia. But after his death, the legislation he spent years pushing may end up giving the Trump administration another tool in its much larger confrontation with China. That's an interesting legacy. Because the most important part of this bill for Beijing may not be the sanctions against Russia. It may be the possibility that Washington can now say, if you continue helping Russia's energy economy, the cost could eventually reach your own economy. So, will Trump actually impose a 100% tariff on China? Maybe, but I wouldn't build the story around that prediction. The more important question is whether Beijing believes Trump is willing to do it. Because if the threat is credible, Trump may never need to use the full 100%. And that is where the broader U.S. China balance becomes clear. America has the broader hand. China has fewer cards, but some of them are difficult to replace and expensive for America to confront. That means this isn't a game where either side can simply force the other to surrender. It's a game of costs, leverage, and timing. And the Russia sanctions bill may be giving Washington one more way to influence that calculation. So the real question is no longer whether Russia and China have an economic relationship. They obviously do. The question is whether that relationship becomes the next front in the U.S.-China strategic competition. The answer may ultimately depend on how Beijing balances the economic benefits of Russian oil against the risk of greater U.S. tariffs. Washington has already put the pieces on the board. Now Beijing has to decide how it wants to play them. And that may be the real legacy of Lindsey Graham's final legislative push. Thanks for watching.